Welcome back to this week's episode of Seeking Proof, Finding Grace. I'm your host, Ron Campbell, and this week, as with every week, I want to start off by reminding you of the most important truth in the entire universe. God loves you. Now, last week we talked about getting ready to start this journey to go from lifelessness to life. And this week, I want to just set the stage one more time, and I want to put out there something for everyone to consider along the way. You know, we've talked about all of the steps that it took to get here, be it from the starting point of the universe to the fine-tuning of the universe to the journey from that Big Bang moment, the beginning point of the universe, to where we find ourselves today. That at each step along the way, what we saw was the fingerprint of an intelligent third party at work. And we're going to see that very same thing along this journey. Except what we're going to see is over and over and over again at each step along the way. Not just the appearance of design. And that's what Charles Darwin would have argued is that it's not actually design that we're seeing, it just looks that way. We've actually come too far to settle for that as a reason. And part of the reason we can say that, or we've come too far to accept that as an explanation for what we're seeing. But part of the reason that we can say that is being able to look at Darwin's theory and determine what is the explanatory value that it provides as we look at the journey as a whole that we're taking. So if Darwin's theory is right, we should be able to look at his theory and we should be able to see direct connections to macroevolution, not microevolution. We talked about that last time. We all understand that species change over time. We get that. And we all understand how we've gone from, a few dog breeds to many dog breeds. We talked about all the doodles that we have out there last time. But what we're looking to see is Darwin's theory effective at explaining macroevolution, the process from nothing, lifelessness, to where we are today? And the answer to that is going to be categorically no. But at each step along the way, I want us to think about that, because the picture that's been painted for us, and this is what Charles Darwin was so good at, was painting a picture and connecting dots. And what we don't always realize is he starts off in the middle of the process and he connects the dots in a wonderful way to see from the middle how we could get to where we are today, but not from the beginning how we could get to where we are today. And I want to illustrate that with a couple of points from G.K. Chesterton's book, The Everlasting Man. Chesterton makes a couple of very interesting notations on this topic. And the amazing thing is, Chesterton wrote that book 100 years ago this year. He wrote it in 1925. And I want to put a couple of thoughts out there that Chesterton did, because there's a couple of things that I had never thought of before that I think he did, in his own dry wit, I think he did such an extraordinary job of putting out there. The first one being this idea of a caveman, and I've got a picture of the caveman here over my shoulder. And I think we've all had that picture painted for us throughout the years. The picture of the caveman, and he's carrying a big wooden club, and he's dragging his poor wife by her hair. And that's just the picture that we all have in our mind of cavemen and what they did. I love this quote from Chesterton because he begins poking holes in that narrative. And that's what we're looking at this week, is the narrative as it exists for us. Chesterton said, "So far as I can understand, his chief occupation, the caveman, in life was knocking his wife about. I've never happened to come upon the evidence for the idea, and I do not know on what primitive diaries or prehistoric divorce reports it is founded. I had never considered it from that perspective. Why in the world do we have this image in our mind of a caveman with a big wooden club dragging his poor wife around by her hair? Where did that come from?" But that narrative has become so interwoven into our culture. When we say caveman, a lot of times, there's a insurance commercial we all think of, but beyond that, we all think of that picture of the guy dragging his wife about by her hair, and no one knows where that came from. And there's probably no truth in it. So when we look at that, the way the picture's drawn sometimes creates this powerful image in our minds of the way things are, and that's not always true. I was struck as I researched this topic by how this is done throughout the study of evolution and the study of biology that we have in high school and colleges today that we were all taught. And many times when we talk about cavemen, or this idea of the evidence that we found for cavemen, we think of something like this. We think of a picture where we can see all of the different theories come together in such an amazing way, and you can see this middle ground between us and primates, us and apes, And you can see this connection. You can see this missing link between the two. And in our minds, we connect the dots that, well, clearly that evidence is there. But so many times it's not. And so what we think of as proof for these missing links, proof that connect us all the way back from us to some prehistoric primate ancestor, is almost wholly, entirely not there. And so as we look at it, a lot of times how you tell the story drives the narrative tremendously. I want to quote again from Chesterton because I think he summarizes this very well. Many times what we're dealing with is one or two small bone fragments. And when those bone fragments are put together, the picture that's drawn is remarkable. And the picture confirms for us that these bone fragments are a missing link between us and a prehistoric ancestor. But the bone fragments themselves cannot possibly account for the picture that's being drawn for us. And Chesterton addresses this. I apologize, this is a little bit of a long quote. But I think walk through it with me, and I think you'll understand why it's important as we do. Again, this is from Chesterton's book, The Everlasting Man. He produces his little bone or little collection of bones and deduces the most marvelous things from it. He found in Java a piece of skull, seeming by its contour to be smaller than the human. Somewhere near it he found an upright thigh bone, and in the same scattered fashion some teeth that were not human. If they all form part of one creature, which is doubtful, our conception of the creature would be almost equally doubtful. But the effect on popular science was to produce a complete and even complex figure finished down to the last detail of hair and habits. And that's very true. And he's talking here about the Java man. And it was a group of very small fossil pieces that later on were discovered to be not from the same creature at all. But these pieces were all put together to produce for us a picture of what we were told was the missing link. And that was almost certainly not true. He was given a name as if he were an ordinary historical character. People talked of him as of Pitt or Fox or Napoleon. Popular histories published portraits of him like the portraits of Charles I or George IV. A detailed drawing was reproduced, carefully shaded to show that the very hairs of his head were all numbered. No uninformed person looking at its carefully lined face and wistful eyes would imagine for a moment that this was the portrait of a thigh bone or of a few teeth and a fragment of a cranium. That picture of Java Man, I think, has been shown to all of us throughout the years. And when we think about it and look at it, it is remarkable. Many of us, again, if I go back to high school when I was learning, I was told that was the missing link that had been found. It was a huge step forward in this process. Only later did I learn that it was almost entirely incorrect, that none of that was true. It's amazing how many steps along the way you're going to find this very same thing. So I want to put out there in front of each of us the steps along the journey where we're going to see the fingerprint of intelligence. And I want you to consider for a moment. Again, you're going to find at each step along the way 3 possibilities. Number 1, luck. It just happened and it was sheer luck. And there's going to be masterful explanations of how luck could account for it or things like that. And in the end, what you'll find is a true neo-Darwinian theory has to rely on luck. It's going to be called mutations or survival of the fittest or all sorts of different things. But when we really get down to it, a true neo-Darwinian theory, when we get down to this idea that evolution could have driven this, it's going to get down to luck. There's also going to be the idea of necessity. And we'll especially talk about this next week when we talk about DNA and RNA. And again, necessity cannot describe this because necessity can't drive any of it unless necessity is driven by an intelligent creator. And then the third possibility will be that of an intelligent outside third party that designed and built us. And that what we're looking at is not the appearance of design, it is actually design itself. And we'll talk about how we can read that, especially next week when we talk about DNA and RNA throughout this process. But let's just talk about a few of these as we go forward. The problem of information throughout the creation of where we are today. So from lifelessness to where we are today, there's an enormous amount of information built into you and I, in DNA and RNA and things like that. The information that is out there demands an explanation, and it will be out there throughout the process of lifelessness to life, and we have to account for that information. how do we make the jump from a chemical world to a biological world? So how do we jump from lifelessness to life? That's huge. We're going to spend at least one episode just talking about all of the things that many of us were taught wrong. All of the things that we were taught about that were proof of how this jump from lifelessness to life, or the caveman portrait that's been painted for us of Java Man or things like that, how all of those things now are recognized as untrue. And yet the record is oftentimes not corrected. I didn't know these things had been disproven hundreds of years before in some cases, over 100 years before in some cases. The Cambrian explosion and the missing links. And again, we're going to spend at least one episode talking about that, because Darwin's theory should be able to explain what the fossil record looks like. And it's not even close. It's exactly the opposite of what Darwin would have expected. We're going to talk about the complexity of life itself, and we're going to break that into a couple of episodes, because Darwin recognized the human eye being a serious problem, but he was able to, again, start in the middle and walk his way through that. But we're going to talk about the complexity of life, not just the human eye, but the complexity of the functionality of life. So we're going to talk about flying and walking and breathing and all of these functions that we see, and how they could have possibly gone from nothing to where they are today. We're going to talk about Richard Dawkins' answer of Mount Improbable that he gives. And Dawkins does a really good job of trying to put together an evolutionary explanation. And what we'll find is it falls flat in explaining the process that we see before us for a lot of good reasons. We'll talk about that. We're going to talk about irreducible complexity and how amazing you and I are, and all of the processes that happen inside of us. We're going to talk about all of that complexity and how it can't possibly be explained through just slow evolutionary processes. Natural selection will fall short every time. And then we're going to talk about human consciousness briefly, because the fact that we are conscious and can think about these things, talk about these things, and ponder these great questions of life defies explanation. So in the weeks to come, we're going to walk through those and talk about those. In those examples, in those various different things to come, you're going to find at least 6 complete deal breakers for neo-Darwinian evolution. And it's not trying to plug in a God of the gaps. It's not trying to say, well, someday we'll figure this out. At every step along the way, what we recognize now, as our knowledge grows, as we're able to look at these things, what we recognize is the clear fingerprint of design. And that is what we're going to see in the weeks to come. Thank you so much for joining us this week. Once again, I hope you'll consider hitting the like and or subscribe button, the like for this podcast and for this episode, and the subscribe button for the podcast. As always, you can find our podcasts on YouTube, Spotify, and iTunes. You can reach out to us on our website at prooftograce.com or via email at prooftograce@yahoo.com. Thank you so much for joining us this week, and I hope to see you again in the weeks to come. Bye-bye.